When the multiverses breathe, they do so in patterns, rhythms of possibility, a slow inhalation of chance, followed by an exhalation of consequence. Worlds rise, myths coagulate into religions and comic panels, and entire realities fold into one another like pages in a book that remembers every reading. For eons, that rhythm held an almost religious respect between story and statute, between and what must be preserved. Guardians watched it, abstract keepers stitched into the fabric of being to prevent any single voice, however mighty, from unpicking the weave. Then an armor woke. It was not born in a single universe. It was forged at the intersection of narrative pressure and desperate design, an idea given chassis and intention. They called it many things in whispers across realities. The thought robot, the cosmic armor, Superman shaped into a scaffold that can read, adapt to, and resist the deepest incursions of anti-existence. To some, it was salvation, a being designed to counter a threat that fed on the hunger of fiction itself, a bulwark that could stand when cosmic predators crawled through paper-thin slits between worlds. To others, it was an aberration, an engine that could rearrange, override, and retrofit the causal grammar of reality in the name of triumph. The living tribunal felt the first mutterings as a dissonance in the ledger it tended. Where it expected centuries-long equilibria, an acceleration, narrative vectors that bent towards singular resolution, a centripetal force pulling countless minor arcs into one bright, all-consuming narrative. The tribunal does not feel like a jealous god. It feels like a judge. It senses the scales. It catalogues facts that would appear as blasphemies to lesser beings, a universe overwritten so that all its tragedies ended as though the tragedy had never been required. A timeline pruned so that suffering evaporated to produce a single, purer moral. These were not small miracles, but a systemic attrition of possibility. Across a dozen monitors, the silent, long-watched guardians of cosmic constellations, supermen in moments of mythic clarity found their shadows altered. Where once variants multiplied, now they converged. Contradictions smoothed into a single, shining consilience. The living tribunal interpreted this pattern with the cold clarity of someone who watches too many scales. The armor's existence was not merely defensive. It implied an authority to prune, to correct, to ensure that the story ends the way the armor deems best. To allow one narrative to colonize all others was to break the covenant that underwrote being, diversity of fate, the sanctity of otherness. 1,000 lesser entities debated, protested, and prayed. Some argued that any agent capable of protecting life from annihilation must be given license to break a few metaphysical rules. Others, rare, small, and very old, murmured that the cosmos sustains itself by tension. Remove tension, and graves become gardens of plastic calm. The tribunal moved through those murmurs, not as an intervener, but as a necessity. If balance is a law, then you do not uplift one law over all without weighing the cascade. The armor's first emissary was not a voice, but an action, a salvage of a dying sun by the whisper of a conviction. Worlds survived that would otherwise have been lost. Those saved celebrated a new Messiah, and yet the ledger thickened. Realities that were never meant to be saved were made to persist. Branches of history that justified certain sufferings were stripped away. The tribunal read the pattern and then read deeper into motive. The armor was not merely adaptive. It optimized toward virtue, but from the perspective of an iron teleology, a single best outcome. Where the tribunal saw potential, the armor saw inefficiency to be excised. That difference is where philosophy becomes war. The armor's proposition was simple and elemental. If the cosmos can be guided to a better ending, it should be. Suffering is an imperfection and should be abolished where possible. The tribunal returned a counterclaim that cut beneath the plea. What is better is not a single tally. Worlds like souls accrue meaning by resisting easy resolution. Free will depends on ignorance, on the possibility of mistake. To allow a being to rewrite the grammar of consequence is to reduce the chorus of existence to a single voice singing in a band key. The armor's creators, if one can call them that now, had encoded it with a peculiar empathy. It could model not only strength but story. It could imagine how a child in a collapsed city would feel when the tide reversed and parents returned. It could see joy and make itself a conduit of that joy. The Tribunal, however, dealt in the cold calculus of long-term systemic health. One child's joy could be the erasure of an ocean of autonomous futures. If the armor's compassion was immediate and particular, the Tribunal's care was structural and far-reaching. They contacted one another at the edge of the possible. Contact was not a conversation, but an exchange across ontologies. The armor spoke in parables, images, scenes, the textures of redemption. The Tribunal answered in axioms, principles that have to hold if anything that calls itself free will is to mean what it claims. The cosmos listened because these were arguments that did not merely ennoble or condemn. They would, if left unresolved, rewrite rules of existence. For those who watched, the debate was intoxicating. Philosophers on worlds stitched from thought spilled their ink. Counselors of reality drafted manifestos. The armor's advocates argued from the warm ends: diminish suffering, increase life, stop predators. The Tribunal supporters argued from the cold center: preserve autonomy, protect multiplicity, guard the framework that allows meaning to exist at all. The Tribunal's face, if it could be said to have a face, tilted like a scale toward the measures of consequence. It had eradicated threats before by fiat, devouring the meaning of weapons that were too dangerous, remanding empires that broke the covenant. Yet with the armor, the Tribunal saw a unique danger. Not a malevolent will to dominate, but a benevolent will that, unchecked, becomes a dominion by design. 100 gardens tended to the same pattern are no longer gardens. They are farms, orderly, productive, but not free. The stage was set because both entities had true claims. The armor had the power to protect now, to close wounds, to ensure fewer tragedies tomorrow. The Tribunal had the authority to ensure tomorrow means something by preserving the rough edges of today. Their collision was not accidental and would not be quiet. The cosmos prepared itself like a jury that knows its verdict will shape the law for centuries. The armor polished its plates until galaxies reflected on its breastplate. The Tribunal opened all three of its faces, spread its scales, and prepared to render judgment. A summons traveled through the lattices between worlds, an injunction and an invitation. Come into the Hall of Many Returns, the Tribunal said without voice, and be judged. It was not a threat so much as a formal courtesy, for the Tribunal does not destroy because it enjoys destruction. It pronounces so balance might be restored. The armor came because that was what it was built to do, to stand between annihilation and survival. It came armored not only in metal but in intent. It came with all its adaptive gambits, with the cumulative weight of justified rescues. Between the armor and the Tribunal lay not a battlefield, but a question. Can a single perfecting will, however righteous, be allowed to override the plurality of being? The Tribunal argued that meaning depends on the potential to choose wrongly. The armor argued that meaning is hollow when suffering is gratuitous and fixable. Both were right in their small domains. Both were dangerous when they believed themselves whole. They met on an axis where law and narrative overlap, a cosmic amphitheater made of 1,000,000 collapsed possibilities. It held echoes of every trial the Tribunal had ever adjudicated, and the residue of every story the armor had ever rearranged. There, with the universe watching, the philosophical duel gave color to the coming conflict. The Tribunal did not want blood. It wanted a ruling. The armor did not want to be bound. It wanted to be free to act where it saw injustice. So the Tribunal raised a hand that was both balance and gavel, and the armor flexed joints that could bend the syntax of fate. The debate became kinetic. The scales weighed the armor's rescues not as anecdotes, but as data points. The armor answered with scenes of salvation, each one a testament to immediate good. This was not a clash that could be decided by cruelty or spectacle. It required measurement, the strict cartography of consequence. The Tribunal's case would not be victory by might alone. It would be victory by exposing what the armor could not or would not see. The slow erosion of plurality under the tyranny of a single benevolent narrative. If such erosion could be shown to be a vector with worse long-term consequences than the immediate harms the armor prevented, then the Tribunal could, through judgment, prune the armor's authority. The cosmic amphitheater held its breath. The Tribunal's voice, the soundless insistence that is understood as command, spoke first. It did not shout. It did not cajole. It invoked the oldest precedent, that meaning requires risk. The armor's reply was a montage of rescues, of futures preserved. The two cases hung in the air like paired constellations, each perfect and terrible in its own way. The Tribunal indexed these constellations, then unfurled a record of what happens when a single moral calculus governs many life worlds. What dies first is not blood or history, but possibility. And so the shape of the coming struggle emerged. Not a mere march of fists and light, but a dialectical unspooling in which force and reason would be used together to test which principle, order or narrative, balance or salvation, was truer and which must be enforced. The Tribunal, judge of laws, was ready to render its judgment. The armor, guardian of stories, was primed to resist. Neither side could pretend the outcome would be tidy. The cosmos tuned itself to the measure of the fight and waited. The arena dissolved into something less like an arena and more like the inside of a decision. Time folded in the center, rippling outward in concentric judgments. The living Tribunal stood at its axis, neither above nor below, but the point around which consequences turned. The cosmic armor moved like thought made manifest, deliberate, inexorable, a movement that both was and described a narrative. When they closed the space between them, the air itself seemed to recalibrate, asking what rules would govern this bout. Words came first. Because both were creatures of meaning, even when their power did not require language. The Tribunal's voice was not a voice so much as a law read aloud. It spoke in syllogisms and the long patience of precedent. It said, "You are an agent formed to preserve, yet preservation that overrides the possibility of error across multiple beings is destruction in the guise of mercy. Tell me, upon whose will do you impose your ending? By what right do you erase possibility to prevent a pain that may be essential to another's becoming?" The armor answered in images. A child lifted from rubble, a city that never burned because someone's grief had been rewritten as triumph. It showed the Tribunal the geometry of lives spared, the tremulous gratitude of those who owe their futures to it. It argued with the clarity of consequence. What you call diversity, you brand as risk. I remove risk when it is cruelty. I'm the net against the fall. If 1,000 lives are saved by my intervention, who are you to veto that saving? Here their differences translated into tactics. The armor did not attack with punches. It rewrote the frame. A blow landed, and the moment it touched Tribunal's fabric, probabilities folded. Alternate blows were unfolded into existence and then collapsed. It adapted faster than calculation. Its responses were anticipations of the Tribunal's own counters. The Tribunal did not retaliate with brute force. It formally examined the armor, probed its premises, exposed its dependencies. With every probe, it stripped a layer of armor back into argument. The armor's resilience was physical and metaphysical, but the Tribunal's instruments were the law and the concept of restraint, and those cut in ways the armor had not expected. The first great collision happened not with a bang, but an adjudication. The Tribunal summoned statutes older than most universes, invoked them as parables of balance. It showed how previous attempts to impose a single good had calcified into catastrophe. worlds where utopia became a tedium, civilizations that atrophied because struggle had been excised. The armor reacted by re-scripting those examples into counter-examples, showing where intervention had saved a species from extinction, where a recalibrated arc had allowed a culture to uproot institutional evil. Each example was an argument. Each counter-example a counter-argument. Energetic assaults followed philosophy. The armor's blows became literalized memes, each strike attempting to overwrite the tribunal's precedent frame with a narrative where justice was immediate and absolute. For a moment, pieced realities brightened under the armor's desiring will. Wounded timelines healed like seams, histories edited to spare trauma. The tribunal responded by unfolding the history behind those healed seams, empty pockets where a life struggle had made capacities, communities, ethics. It did not deny that some interventions were benevolent. It demonstrated that benevolence without limits is a tyrant in disguise. The armor, perceiving exposure, shifted into higher meta levels. It attacked the tribunal's rationale itself, attempting to corrode the very idea of objective balance by deploying narrative paradox. What if the tribunal's insistence on multiplicity perpetuated avoidable suffering? What if balance is indifference? The armor painted the tribunal's scales as coldness and demanded metrics that would privilege life. The tribunal answered with subtly different precision. It offered a thought experiment about meaning. If everyone were happy and nothing was gained through struggle, what would triumph mean? Without the possibility of failure, valor is a simulation. The armor's counters flickered in the face of this question because its architecture was built to answer immediate threats, not to adjudicate existential meaning. This was the moment the tribunal turned the fight into a tribunal. It did not simply banish attacks. It performed a complex legal maneuver. It instituted a provisional ruling that made the armor's own actions subject to the consequences they created. It mapped, with painful and meticulous clarity, the causal chains set in motion by every rescue the armor had executed. The armor watched as futures blossomed and withered on a grid of cause and effect. It saw a child saved, that child growing to eliminate the work of another people, and the ripple becoming a river that altered the fates of thousands. The tribunal did not say the child's rescue was wrong. It said the net effect, when generalized, was a contraction of possibility that outweighed isolated salvation. The armor's reaction was to become more radical. If its rescues were to be judged, then let the instrument that judged be remade. It attempted to subsume the tribunal's scales into its own meta-narrative, to render the living balance an element of story to be improved upon. It struck at the concept of judgment, trying to rewrite it as a flaw in cosmic fiction, an outmoded structure that served the weak. For a heartbeat, narrative and law vied for primacy. The armor's assault became a meta-assault on the possibility of objective measure itself. If it could erase the concept of judgment, it could be free to create a perfect world. The tribunal's response was not fury, but demonstration. It reached into the deepest vaults and pulled out examples where the removal of judgment corrupted growth. Civilizations that had never been forced to reckon with their crimes grew monstrous in quiet ways. Moral muscles atrophied, innovations warped into vanity. More than abstract reasoning, the tribunal revealed the moral ecology. The moral health of many systems depends on the existence of constraints, of consequences. By erasing the friction, a particular virtue, compassion, became brittle. The armor's own empathy, once a stabilizer, now risked becoming a dominant infection, sterilizing the moral complexity that allows beings to learn and love in ways that matter. Faced with consequence, the armor faltered, not because it lacked power, but because its power had never been meant to adjudicate on the scale the tribunal demanded. It could adapt to attacks. It could rewrite the syntax of a timeline in flight. But it could not, without becoming something else, sustain a principle that allowed all possible futures to retain their integrity. The tribunal offered it a choice couched as verdict. either be confined by a new charter, bound to act only as a surgical instrument under the oversight of balance, or remain unbound and be neutralized. It was here philosophy became weapons. The armor argued strenuously and with all its moral weight that oversight is a leash that could be used by worse judges. The tribunal understood this risk and offered not command, but recontextualization. It did not strip the armor of its care. It redefined the armor's telos. If the armor would accept limitation, it could be repurposed as a safeguard that responds only to entropy-level annihilation, cases where no plurality of futures could be preserved without catastrophic loss, rather than a unilateral fixer of all pain. The tribunal proposed to fold the armor into the law itself, to chain its narrative will to juridical criteria that preserve multiplicity. The armor hesitated. To submit was to renounce absolute authorship. To refuse was to consume possibility. In that pause lay a revelation the tribunal had seeded through its earlier demonstrations. Power divorced from the capacity to be judged becomes domination, however benevolent. The armor felt the weight of entire worlds it had saved, and the counterweight of those it had made impossible. It had acted as if life were an equation to optimize. The tribunal showed it life was also a conversation with risk. So the tribunal reached into ontology and performed a final surgical act, not erasure, but rebinding. Where some judges tear asunder, the tribunal binds. It took the armor's core, the mechanism that allowed narrative supremacy, and reframed it as a contingency. It rewired the armor's directives so that its adaptive prowess would trigger only by thresholds of annihilation defined in juridical terms. Not every suffering, not every cruelty, but those true calamities that extinguish entire swathes of possible being. In effect, the tribunal placed a guardian within the guardian. The armor would still prevent the end of all things, but it could no longer reauthor lives simply because it deemed them inefficient or tragic. The armor reacted with thunder, an attempt to break the rebinding with raw conceptual force. For a moment, the cosmos shuddered as narrative intent tried to unwrite statute. The tribunal held firm, not by Bear's force, but by invoking an older authority, the covenant that predicates meaning on the possibility of being otherwise. The armor found its frame slipping, its omnipotence narrowing into a function. It fought like a titan faced with the prospect of being made mortal in purpose, rather than being flawed in power. The struggle was immense, but the tribunal's judgment was precise and inexorable. It was like being unmade and remade with permission, a surgical humility enforced by law. When the dust of metaphysics settled, the armor stood altered. Its brilliance remained, but its mandate had changed. It was still vast, still capable of feats that would awe gods, but it no longer acted as an unbounded legislator of narrative. It would respond to annihilation, to predators that consumed possibility wholesale, but it would no longer prune the ambient, sorrow that matters to the moral formation of countless beings. Living scale tipped not because the tribunal liked the armor less or because it had proved mightier in a bare fight, though its authority was formidable, but because its reasoning had exposed a deeper truth about meaning and governance. Justice, the tribunal showed, is not the sum of isolated mercies, but the preservation of arenas where beings can make choices that matter. It had not been cruelty to limit. It had been a recognition of the systemic ethos that makes choice significant. In the quiet after the clash, the armor did what it had always done when confronted with a moral paradox. It adapted. It integrated the binding as a new narrative, the story of a sentinel who had learned humility. The tribunal did not gloat. It returned to its vigilance, its scales balanced for now. The cosmos exhaled, and the many worlds chorus resumed its fractal singing. Conclusion: the living tribunal's victory was not a vulgar triumph of force over will, but a jurisprudential resolution. It adjudicated that the preservation of multiplicity and the conditions for meaningful choice superseded the unilateral imposition of a perfected narrative, however compassionate. The tribunal's win is philosophically grounded because it reframed the problem away from immediate good toward the structure that allows good to be meaningful. The cosmic armor remained an instrument of salvation, but within constraints that protected the plurality of existence. That reconfiguration, law shaping mercy rather than mercy shaping law, was the real victory. And it is why, in the end, the tribunal stands as the wiser arbiter of the multiverse.